Welcome back to EconLine, everybody. This lesson is going to be about unemployment. We're going to look at a couple of things in this lesson. First, why we're concerned about unemployment. Next, we'll look at how the unemployment rate is determined. And then lastly, we're going to take a look at different kinds of unemployment as well as the history of unemployment up to the current day. So the first thing that we want to look at is why we monitor the unemployment rate. The first one is pretty obvious. Individuals care about the unemployment rate because it directly affects their standard of living, their happiness, etc. So if the unemployment rate is very high and it's difficult to find jobs, that's a concern for a nation's citizens. Economists also measure unemployment for a slightly different reason. Because, crass as it may sound, human beings are a resource within the society. Remember, they're labor. So we'd like to know if all of our resources are fully employed. If we have resources, and in this case that would be workers, who are involuntarily unable to find work, that tells us that we're not utilizing all of our resources efficiently and that as a nation we're most likely underproducing. So how do we measure the unemployment rate? Well, it's measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they do this by conducting a monthly survey. So they call different people and they'll speak with them, ask them questions about their employment status, and once they have a large enough sample size, which is around 60,000 people, they manage to project out what the unemployment rate looks like in the entire country. So, who counts in the unemployment rate? Well, first we start off with the total population. Just a brief note here, these figures are from late in the year 2010, so we would expect that they're or early in 2011, so these figures are slightly different now, but the principles underlying them are still all the same. Alright, so we start with our total population. And in the United States we have roughly 310 million people. And we have to subtract some people, because not everybody really counts in the unemployment rate. Let's take a look at who we take out. First thing we have to do is remove people who are just not able to work because they're too young, because they're in the military, or they're in some kind of jail or another locked facility. And these people are literally not available for work. They cannot take jobs. So after we've taken them out, that leaves us with the civilian non-institutional population 16 years or older. And what that really means is all of the people in the country who would possibly be available to work. Now, the unemployment rate isn't necessarily based on all of them as well, because not everybody who's part of this population is actually looking for work. So if you decide that you don't want a job, for example, because you're retired or because you don't need to work or some other reason, then we would say that you're not even in the labor force. Remember that from an economic perspective, again, laborers are a resource that we're trying to measure the use and the utilization of. If somebody's not looking for work, they're not interested in working, then they're not really a resource for the country. Only those people who are willing to work and are able to work are the ones that we're concerned with for our economic performance, at least in that end. So that leaves us with the civilian labor force. So we start off with our total population, we subtract the people who are not physically available for work, and then we subtract the people who are not willing to work, and that leaves us in this case with about 154 million people in the United States. So civilian labor force is where we actually base the unemployment rate off of. A little sidebar to this is a stat from, or a statistic that a lot of economists watch called the labor force participation rate. That tells you what percentage of the adults in the country are actually available and looking for work. In poorer nations, you would probably find a higher labor force participation rate because they would have to in order to maintain their standard of living. In very wealthy countries like the United States, where production is so high, many people are not forced to take jobs, such as stay-at-home parents, retired adults, and so on. So in many cases, the wealthier countries will have lower labor force participation rates, although this is not a rule. This is just things that we normally tend to observe. All right, so we're back to looking at our civilian labor force and who's employed and who's not. So if you're down to the civilian labor force, we will start off by saying that those people can fall into one of two categories. They're either employed or they're unemployed. If you're employed, let's look at the characteristics. All right, so an employed person worked at least 1 hour. Some people who work in their own business are considered employed because even though you don't have a job somewhere else, you're working. If you worked 15 hours as an unpaid worker for a family-owned business, they still consider that employed as well. And primarily in that case because you're not necessarily available for work elsewhere if you're working on the family farm. And then lastly, if you were temporarily absent, so you didn't work this week but you actually have a job, we wouldn't count you as unemployed. And that leaves us with our unemployed. Who actually counts as unemployed in the United States? Well, here are the different characteristics. One, you didn't work. and you looked for work, and you're available for work. Second, if you were laid off and you're waiting to be called back from a job, you're also considered unemployed. And if you're waiting to report for a job that doesn't start for like a month or something like that, then you're also still considered unemployed because, again, we're trying to measure unemployment in a given period. And if you're waiting more than 30 days to report to a job, well, then you're still unemployed in this period. It's the next period where you would actually become employed. So the unemployment rate ultimately is the number of unemployed people divided by the labor force. So not the total population minus the people who are unwilling or unable to work. The unemployment rate in the United States at this point, and again this is early 2011, was 9.3%. And as of this recording, which is November of 2012, the unemployment rate is down in the mid-8s, maybe even slightly lower at this point. Here's another graphical representation of how the population in the United States breaks down. So again, we have our total population is represented by the circle, and as you can see, roughly half of them are in the labor force, and roughly half are not in the labor force. Some because they're not available for work, and some because they're not willing to work. Of this half of the population that is in the labor force, however, the overwhelming majority are employed, and a few are unemployed. A brief note on this too, before we conclude this portion of the lesson. The unemployment rate does not always take into account discouraged workers, or it never takes into account discouraged workers. When a person is unable to find work and after some period of time eventually gives up and stops looking, they're no longer counted in the unemployment rate. So we know that the unemployment rate is not a perfect measure of everybody who's working and not working in our economy, but at least in the sense that we calculate it and track it in a consistent manner in each period, it gives us some idea of the performance or the direction the economy is headed in. In this section on unemployment, we're going to talk about the different types of unemployment, and then we're going to look at some historical unemployment figures just to see where the unemployment rate has gone over the last few years. So, people can be unemployed for a variety of reasons. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to classify people into the proper categories of their unemployment. And in addition, you should be able to tell whether or not somebody is counted at all in the unemployment rate. But keep in mind at this point that everything that we talk about here is going to apply directly to people who actually are unemployed. So this will not apply to the people who are not in the labor force. Okay, so one type of unemployment is called frictional unemployment. Frictionally unemployed people are people who have skills that we use in our economy. They just don't have a job right now. So they're going to get one most likely, and it's just a mismatch for a short period of time where you're never really going to have everybody in the same job that they want at all times. On any given day, some people are going to leave work, some people are going to graduate, they'll enter the workforce, and there are people who have skills and they're going to get jobs, they just don't have them yet. A subset of frictional unemployment is called seasonal unemployment. Again, somebody has a set of skills that's useful to the country, except we just don't need them right now. So in the example you see here, obviously we're not going to use very many lifeguards in the middle of winter. So somebody who is seasonally unemployed is technically considered frictionally unemployed because they do have a skill that the economy uses. We can distinguish frictional and seasonal unemployment from structural unemployment. Somebody who's structurally unemployed does not have skills that we can use in our economy. There are most unemployment or structural unemployment in the economy is caused by a very small number of workers who are unemployed for a very long time. So for whatever reason, typically through the process of creative destruction, the economy shifts in a way that people who previously had jobs can no longer find work. In the picture you see here, it's kind of harkening back to the days of gas station attendants who largely were replaced by an automatic shut-off switch on the pump. So it used to be that people were paid to pump gas, so individuals wouldn't have to get out of their car and stand there and watch because at some point when the gas tank starts, or when the gas tank is full, it'll overflow. When they developed the little mechanism that's in the pumps now to where once they're full to stop, most of the people who were gas station attendants lost their jobs. Provided they didn't have some other skill, they probably remained unemployed for a long time following that. And that's what we call structural unemployment. There are a couple other examples of structural unemployment, such as in the 1980s, a large number of air traffic controllers were fired during a strike, and they had a very specialized and in-demand skill that was able to get them a very high-paying job as an air traffic controller. But once they left that field, or once they were forced to leave that field, there was no way for them to find another job that could pay anything even close to what they were making before. That set of skills didn't transfer to other occupations, and therefore many of those people became structurally unemployed. The kind of unemployment, though, that we're going to be most concerned with in an economics course is called cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment occurs because of the business cycle. So there's some kind of fluctuation in production levels that cause us to need fewer workers. So for example, and as you can see in the picture, all of these people, truck drivers, accountants, economists, are people that in our economy we have jobs for and that we do use. But there are times, for example, during a recession where we just don't have very many jobs for those people. So the truck driver, for example, may find him or herself unemployed until economic conditions improve. It could be a while. It's not necessarily about structural unemployment because they do have a valuable skill. We'll be studying the business cycle in great detail through the rest of this semester. We're also going to be looking in depth at different kinds of unemployment and how that's going to affect the business cycle, or rather, I should say, how the business cycle affects those. Okay, let's take a look at some history of the unemployment rate. This is fairly recent data, again, going up to the time this presentation was created. So we saw in late 2008 and then through 2009 and 2010 a sudden rise in the unemployment rate. This was as the real estate market collapsed and the recession began along with it in the last quarter of 2008. We see that for a while the unemployment rate moved mostly sideways but fell a little bit, and today you would find it right in this area over here. So we've had some ups and downs in the period since then. We're a little bit lower, and as of November of 2012, we're hopeful that that's a trend that's going to continue into the future. This is what the unemployment rate looks like over a 60-year period from 1948 to, well, about 2010 actually. As you can see, it goes up and down in different periods, and you can oftentimes see, certain national events. There was a mild recession in this period, perhaps worsened by September 11th, if not caused by it. This is the recession that we're in currently. There was a recession in 1990, most likely helped to cause George Bush Sr. to lose his job as president, and then, as discussed in other lessons, recessions that took place in the 70s and 80s. So we had a pretty high unemployment rate in the early 1980s. We didn't see that again all the way until this period in 2008 to 2010. So the period that we're experiencing right now, even if you look over the last few years, we're still experiencing very high unemployment compared to the historical average. And by the way, that historical average is here, and we call this the natural rate of unemployment. And the natural rate of unemployment is the amount of unemployment that the economy would normally experience. So it would be seasonal, frictional, and structural unemployment would constitute the natural rate. And by the way, on many exams and things, you'll just see it called frictional plus structural because seasonal is included. We think that the natural rate of unemployment is somewhere between 5 to 5.3%. Periodically, economists will revise that number based on economic data. About 10 to 15 years ago, people thought that actually about 20 years ago, people thought the natural rate of unemployment was closer to 6%. Our experience during the 90s and much of the 2000s showed us that we actually could sustain lower rates of unemployment without having high rates of inflation. The natural rate, though, is what we figure is probably our best case for getting everybody employed. So as economists, we don't want to see zero unemployment because we realize that some people should be looking for jobs because they just had a temporary switch. We realize that some people probably don't have the skill set to be employed gainfully in a job. So if they do have jobs, that's probably an indication to us that we're trying to do a little bit too much, economically speaking. So we see the natural rate is at that 5% range as being kind of our goal for unemployment, what we would experience kind of like we call this full employment. It doesn't mean that it's zero unemployment, it just means that it's the greatest number of people that could be efficiently employed in the nation are able to find jobs.